Good evening, everyone. Is the volume okay? Okay, thank you. I wrote a paper just for you. And I will leave it with Johan so that it can be circulated. I have been given exactly 45 minutes, and so I clearly cannot read all my paper. So I'm going to read and discuss sections of it. I also have put together a PowerPoint guideline so that you can stay with me through the lecture. So let me briefly introduce the paper, situated within the broader work that I am doing, and then I will start reading my paper. So this is, I thank Johan and Nick and the African Economic History Workshop. This is part of a larger book on the first generation of independent African leaders and the making of the African nation state. And it has 5 chapters, and one is on African socialism, because you cannot write about the period between 1950 and about 1980 and not speak about African socialism. So this is an important chapter. In this period, African socialism was not only important, it was even fashionable. But what was African socialism about? And all the key experiments that I would allude to failed. So is there anything that we should remember? Is it just a historical moment or episode? Or is there something about that spirit and its objectives that we need to revisit for some of our contemporary challenges? I make 3 related arguments. That African socialism was at the heart of a search for an indigenous economic model of development. 2, that its task was to achieve broad transformative change in a society in the shortest possible time. And they did not believe that capitalism, with its trickle-down economics, would do what they wanted to do in that sort of urgency with which they were faced. 3, it had a boldness of imagination that we have rarely encountered since from that generation. And in my conclusion, I'll come to speak very specifically of Nkrumah, and how, even though much of what he had planned was not achieved, subsequent governments keep going back to his vision and taking aspects and implementing them. So that generation was noted for the boldness of their vision. The structure of the paper: there's an introduction. I will discuss immediate historical background and intellectual influences. I'll talk briefly about the challenges at independence, and then African socialism to the rescue. And we know they could not rescue the economists, but they left an important legacy that I want us to revisit. And then in my concluding thoughts, the question I raise is whether we can keep the baby and throw out the bathwater. It may not be about resurrecting the model or the practice, but what does that vision tell us? And what is important about that vision for today? So that's the agenda, and as I read, I will put up what we need so that you can stay with me. So essentially, I'll have 4 case studies: Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, Guinea under Ahmed Sekou Touré, Senegal under Senghor. And you know we cannot exclude Nyerere. So Tanzania and Ujamaa under Nyerere. So, the introduction. On the attainment of independence in the latter 1950s and 1960s, African nationalist governments found themselves in an economic quandary, faced by the huge socio-economic needs of populations just emerging from colonial rule. These new governments needed nothing short of a revolution to pull themselves and their countries out of decades of social, economic, and political neglect. One of the first cabinet ministers in the Patrice Lumumba government in independent Congo in 1960 told Basil Davidson in the documentary on the rise of African nationalism that there were only 3 college graduates in the Congo on independence. Then there were 2 available economic models. Either you were capitalist or you went towards socialism or communism. The first, when explored by these new governments, often smacked of new colonialism by putting them back in the arms of Western expatriate capital, seemingly subverting the achievement and the purpose of political independence. In the context of the Cold War, mention of socialism or communism was interpreted as an alignment with the Eastern Bloc and with countries such as the Soviet Union and with China. The recent 20th century revolutions of Russia and China had given their imprint to the concept of revolution, obscuring the transformative impact of revolutions in nation building, as evidenced in the 18th century revolutions in France, the United States, and Haiti. Striking out in a determination for economic self-reliance, African nationalist leaders coined the concept of African socialism, which seems to hold different meanings for its advocates. Yet its adherents, when placed in the camp of the Soviet Union or China by the West, protested their discomfort. This paper explores the perception that African socialism was at its roots a search for an indigenous model of economic development that was revolutionary both in time and scale. A close reading of the writings of some of its key advocates, such as Senegal's Leopold Senghor or Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, underscores that they were not ignorant of Marxist theory. Indeed, one of the best expositions of the thought and works of Marx and Engels that I have read is by Leopold Senghor, called On African Socialism. That the emphasis in African socialism varied for its various advocates perhaps reflected the unique circumstances of each new nation's challenges. These leaders believed that while Marxism was an important method, it needed to be modified for the African context, where industrialization was minor, urbanization not that developed, class struggle was not the driver of history, and religion was an important aspect of lived realities. Socialism was a method with an ethic of egalitarianism that could be grounded in African history and culture, hence the adjective African socialism. President John F. Kennedy was perceptive in discerning, after meeting several of Africa's new leaders, that they were at heart nationalists and not communists, and their desire and intent was to develop their countries. After meeting Sekuturi in 1961, Kennedy would instruct USAID to put together a modest aid program for Guinea, and that Sekuturi would then stop his socialist rhetoric. In this paper, I explore the pursuit of African socialism and its intent by Ghana under Nkrumah, Guinea under Sekuturi, Senegal under Senghor, and Tanzania under Nyerere. 4 instructive careers seldom analyzed together today. My focus is on the economics of the paradigm, though it is difficult to parse economics and politics, as socialism is an approach to political economy. Several works exploring African socialism was published in the 1960s and the 1970s, the heydays, including some by the architects of the concept. The 1980s put paid to the concept and the vision, as steep decline resulted in what has been labeled as Africa's lost decade. The most notable architect of African socialism, Nyerere, considered that his attempt at Ujamaa had failed and stepped down from power in 1985. And then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 marked the triumph and ascendancy of capitalism. After that, it was almost unfashionable to talk about socialism. It is only more recently that a few works have revisited the vision and practice of African socialism. But these works have often been single country studies. That economic development has remained elusive in Africa is clear. That many of the social and economic challenges that inspired the concept of African socialism remain with us cannot be denied. Is there merit in revisiting what was envisioned in African socialism? Not with the aim of resurrecting it as a practice or economic model, but in re-engaging the desire for broad transformative change, especially as commentators have observed that its architects envisioned a bold future unparalleled by subsequent governments. Can we throw out the bathwater and keep the baby? The dream of rapid socio-economic change that left no one behind. So we move to a section looking at the immediate historical background and intellectual influences. Whereas vision speaks to intent, agenda is a plan of action. And Africa's new leaders needed a developmental agenda to lift their citizens out of poverty and illiteracy. There was a huge dearth in human and financial capital. Very little physical infrastructure existed in African colonies outside of settler colonies. And the little that existed was designed for extraction and export of natural resources from colonies, and not for the coherent, integrated growth of national economies. Former President Jakaya Kikwete of Tanzania reflected in a recent interview in 2017 about how Tanzania on independence had only 3 medical doctors and 2 engineers. This then explains the paradox, how many African nationalist governments inherited or assumed the economic agendas of their former colonial rulers. In the aftermath of World War II, the colonial state became a developmental state as it sought to develop colonial economies to the benefit of the metropole. This period has been described as the second colonial occupation, marked by a technocratic bent to colonialism, as colonial officers promoted reforms in agricultural practices, introduced mechanization and irrigation, explored new sources of energy, and laid the foundation for the first wave of import substitution industries. This vision required infrastructural development that would provide the electric power for manufacturing and put in place a transport system that integrated the whole economy in more coherent ways. Out of this endeavor was born development economics, which first operated under the name of colonial economics, with its focus on the economic development of tropical colonies. This shift in late colonial rule explains why several of the early African nationalist governments adopted the economic policies of late colonial rule, because the colonial government had begun to shift towards development. Pioneers in development economics included prominent economists such as the West Indian William Arthur Lewis, who was trained at the London School of Economics and worked as a consultant in the Colonial Office during World War II. His work at the Colonial Office and his growing knowledge of the colonial economies of Africa, Latin America, and Asia led Lewis to revise central assumptions in new classical economics. In the developing world, where poverty was deep-seated, resources limited, populations growing rapidly, and no indigenous middle class existed, Lewis concluded that the state will have to assume a central role in driving economic growth. state leadership and centralized planning, together with lessons learned from Keynes in the Great Depression, such as state spending on infrastructure as a way of stimulating production and consumption, all came to inform development economics. Industrialization was assigned a primary role, and Lewis's articles, especially his 1954 article on economic development with unlimited supplies of labor, and this is what won him the Nobel Prize in the mid-70s, gave, in the words of his biographer Robert Tignor, an aura of inevitability to economic growth once the processes he had laid out were followed. Lewis was a Fabian socialist, and several of Africa's leaders in the 1930s and 40s had encountered Fabianism as students in the United Kingdom. Beno Ndulu observes that the most prominent among the first generation of African leaders, for example, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Kaunda, Kenyatta, and Senghor, espoused the Fabian socialism intellectual tradition as well as ideology. The influences on African socialism were complex. This reformist drive after World War II by the colonial government overlapped with the beginnings of the Cold War, and European colonial powers sought to convince the United States that their colonies were essential to their capacity to assist against the designs of the Soviets in the developing world. American support for Western Europe through policies such as the Marshall Plan gave new life to empire. As Philip Muhlenberg has noted of the Eisenhower administration, its African policy was little more than an extension of the Marshall Plan, predicated upon ensuring that African resources remained accessible for Western Europe's recovery from World War II. American scholars in the social sciences, with the financial support of government and private institutions, were also engaged with developing a framework that would enable the United States engage the newly independent and decolonizing countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. This impetus gained momentum when Kennedy became president in 1961, under the framework that came to be known as modernization theory, America's blueprint for economic prosperity in an industrialized society and a bulwark against Soviet communism. American social scientists at the forefront of modernization theory include scholars such as Daniel Lerner, David Apter, and our own Samuel Huntington at Harvard, several of whom studied the Third World. Kennedy would invite the distinguished MIT economist Walt Rostow to join his National Security Council and lead the agenda on modernization. Rostow launched the Kennedy Development Decade with a policy goal of helping other countries learn to grow. The work of Rostow would prescribe the stages of economic growth and what needed to be done to move from subsistence to market economies. The very title of his 1964 book, The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto, underscored the context and the contest of the Cold War. But the narrative of modernization was complicated, for not only capitalist societies could lay claim to having modernized economies. The Soviet Union was also a modernized economy. Niles Gilman notes, and I quote him, to explain how the Soviet Union could be both the same modern and different from the United States or the West. Modernization theory described communism as pathological or deviant form of modernity, always hoping that the Soviets would converge with the liberal version of modernity extant in the West. Quotation closed. Instructively, both modernization theory and communism believed in industrialization, large-scale infrastructure projects, and the transformation of agriculture. The Kennedy government from 1961 moved away from Eisenhower's policy position on Africa, which was, for Eisenhower, the Africa position was essentially to ally with European settlers and European colonizers, based on the argument of John Foster Dulles, after whom Dulles Airport is named. And he was then the Secretary of State. For Dulles, Third World nationalism was only a Soviet creation, and claims of Cold War neutrality or non-alignment was in reality a transitional stage to communism. In place of this, Kennedy forged an African policy based on 4 principles. First, opposition to European colonial rule. And he would vote against Portugal in the UN and all kinds of things that made the NATO allies very crazy. 2 was acceptance of African non-alignment. So whether you seem to be leaning towards the Soviets, once you said you were non-aligned, he gave you an aid package. 3 was the offer of economic development packages to African countries. And 4, he initiated a new period of personal diplomacy. Kennedy, over 3 years, invited 28 African heads of states to the White House. On average, he saw 1 African president every month. It's never happened even after that. This nuanced position would explain enigmatic developments in early independent Africa, like the World Bank's design and support of Tanzania's early villagization scheme. And I was surprised to find out that the World Bank designed, before Ujamaa, the first phase of villagization. The challenges at independence. And because I have 4 countries, for each section now, I'll just choose 1 country just to give you a flavor, because you'll get the paper to read. The first wave of African independence was achieved from the late 1950s. Sudan became independent in 1956, followed by Ghana in 1957. And a slew of Francophone countries and Nigeria became independent in 1960. The pace continued as each year witnessed the lowering of colonial flags and the raising of the flags of new African independent states. Development was the primary challenge and objective of the new states. By this was meant an improved standard of life, as seen in key indicators such as better access to housing, health, education, jobs. Many of the new nations seemed ill-prepared for this gargantuan task. Guinea-Conakry achieved notoriety by voting no in the 1958 referendum on the new French community. And France retaliated by withdrawing financial and material support. And French officials, as they left, stripped Guinea of records, equipment, and anything that could be moved, and destroyed what could not be removed. They were so petty they even severed the telephone lines. Guinea became independent on October 2nd, 1958. It was Kwame Nkrumah's loan of £10 million in late November 1958, after the 2 countries had come into some vague union. That prevented Guinea's collapse. In terms of statistics, Guinea, with all its records destroyed, did not even have a baseline from which to plan economically. Guinea's president, Sekou Touré, a trade unionist who had been tagged by American intelligence agencies as a communist from the early 1950s, explained to William Atwood, America's first ambassador to Guinea, that Guinea was, I quote him, so poor that it cannot be concerned with ideology, only action, quotation closed. As late as 1994, 1995, 85% of the employed workforce in Guinea had no formal education at all. This is not 1958. This is 1994, 1995. In 2001, only 10% of Guinea's roads were surfaced, and only 0.8% of Guinea's rural population had access to electricity. This is where I skip all the other countries. In none of the black African nation states did an indigenous capitalist class exist. This perhaps would have been a contradiction under the colonial dispensation. It was clear that the state would have to play a central role in economic development. That foreign capital would be important was also evident. But states that had just come out of colonialism were justifiably wary of foreign capital from Western Europe. This was too close to the immediate colonial past and threatened what Nkrumah characterized as neocolonialism. Key ideals such as positive neutralism for Kwame Nkrumah, or for Nyerere, self-reliance, came to define fervent desires that would inform new economic models. Capitalism, with its trickle-down economics, would not bring about the rapid transformation desired by new nations with huge needs. Socialism or communism would put them in the Soviet or Eastern camp, which came with its own liabilities. The new African nations claimed that they were non-aligned, taking their inspiration from the Bandung movement of 1955. They insisted on the freedom to be associated with not either or, but both the East and the West, without being labeled ideologically. Africa's new leaders were attracted to the US in its ability to customize aid programs for the specific needs of different countries. Aid from the Soviet Union tended to be inflexible, often coming in the form of military aid or the bartering of Soviet and Eastern European goods and products for African goods. Oftentimes, the Soviet bloc goods were not even useful. So at one point in time, the Soviet Union gave Guinea-Conakry a gift of snow plows. It doesn't snow in West Africa. Africa's new leaders turned to the United States, which had not held colonies in Africa. And astute American politicians like JFK discerned that these leaders were more of nationalists than ideologues. And Africa's leaders were not above playing both sides, because they also noted that the United States paid more attention if you played both sides, and someone like Houphouët-Boigny, who claimed he was just capitalist, got less attention than those who played both sides. So now I skip more countries. I've mentioned that 28 presidents visited with Kennedy. And I wanted to show you, I've been using the Kennedy Library, and there are wonderful photographs of these visits, and I've been reading the notes and things. So this is Sekou Touré visiting with Kennedy. And what touched the African leaders is that after the meeting or after dinner, he would take the African presidents upstairs to meet Jackie and the kids. And you know we love family. And it left a major impression that, you know, this guy is personal. I mean, this is our friend. This is Nkrumah visiting with Kennedy. You all know who this one is, right? Okay, so that is Nyerere, boyish looking. And this is Senghor with Kennedy and Jackie. I haven't gotten here yet, but I'll put it there. African socialism became an important model for economic development for countries like Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, and Tanzania. But the model looked different in each of these four important case studies, with a common thread being the desire for political and economic autonomy, self-reliance, the Africanization of business and the civil service, Pan-Africanism, and non-alignment. The United States closely followed the political and economic developments in newly African countries, monitoring Soviet influence and investments from the Eastern Bloc. It listened keenly to rhetoric, trying to discern political alignment from what Africa's new leaders said. Kennedy was persuaded that a modest economic aid package would move Guinea towards the United States, and he did that. Nyerere was seen as a person of principle and integrity, and it's interesting to read notes on him. And his socialist experiment would interestingly receive significant aid from Western countries. So that is the only socialist experiment that both West and East supported. According to a CIA report from April 1963, I quote, Ghana's vain and egocentric Kwame Nkrumah is driven by his dreams of primacy in a united Africa and of a world role as a leading figure among the non-aligned states. The CIA didn't like Nkrumah at all. Senghor, despite his profession of African socialism, maintained ties to France and the European common market, enabling Senegal to mobilize substantial external resources that postponed the need for structural change in an underperforming economy. All four African leaders professed African socialism. And though the African socialism shared commonalities, there were also important differences. These attempts at African socialism, Mercer Cook points out, and I like Mercer Cook's quote, was bitter gall to the communists, who are taught to take their Marxism straight without ice cube or aspirin. I mean, either you're a socialist or you're a communist or not. But this African socialism business. But the Africans insisted not only on having their socialism, but they wanted an African socialism. The next section explores the experiment and record of African socialism in our 4 case studies. So this is the substance of the paper. And here I use their own works to describe what they believed in and what they advocated in. And then I look at the performance of their economies. And we all know that all 4 economies didn't do well. So we can see that. We are fortunate that all 4 statesmen were writers who put their philosophies in record. There are some common threads to their philosophical reflections on African socialism. All view the ideological positions as central to nation building, and that the process of wielding together new nations from disparate ethnic groups and instilling patriotism required ideological education. All view the independence of their countries as connected to the broader movement to liberate the entire continent from colonial rule. All emphasize the revival of the cultural values of an African past, but in ways that position them for the contemporary world. All valued economic self-reliance and non-alignment. And then after that, they went their separate ways. Whereas Nkrumah, Senghor, and Nyerere had encountered leftist ideologies as students who studied in Europe or in the United States, Sekou Touré's rise was as a trade unionist, someone the intellectuals within the African Democratic Rally looked down on because he only had a school-leaving certificate or a certificat d'études. Indeed, Sekou Touré seems not to have had a leftist agenda until he was pushed in that direction by the young radicals in his country, especially those who had been educated in France. Senghor, on the other hand, was an erudite, a product of the Sorbonne, and the first black African to attain the distinction of agrégé, the highest teaching diploma in France. This erudition shines powerfully in Senghor's On African Socialism, which I recommend that you should read. It is brilliant. Senghor reflected on the parting of ways between Senegalese nationalists and the French Socialist Party in 1948, after the Africans came to appreciate that French workers together with the bourgeoisie were all beneficiaries of colonial rule, and that colonialism and class struggle did not necessarily align. Now let me quote Senghor because he is very clear in distinguishing what they are. They are not Marxists, they are not communists, but what they are. So I quote him, "We are not Marxists in the sense given the word today, insofar as Marxism is presented as atheistic metaphysics, a total and totalitarian view of the world, a Weltanschauung. We are socialists," and he puts it in italics. In other words, we shall exclude neither Marx nor Engels from our sources. We shall start from their works as from those of utopian socialists. And we shall add to these sources the works of their successors and commentators. But we shall retain only the method and the ideas. The method to help us analyze our situations. The ideas to help us to solve our problems. Quotation closed. Senghor points out rightly that Marx was a philosopher who became interested in economics because of his interest in the conditions of the European working class. He states accurately, and I quote him, "We must not consider Marx as an economist like Keynes, but as a sociologist, a philosopher." Quotation closed. Senghor then goes on to make an additional clarification. We are not communists, and offers theoretical and practical reasons why they are not communists. And just in case the West thought they had a convert in the making, he affirms, and I quote him, "Nevertheless, we shall not be won over to a regime of literal capitalism and free enterprise. We cannot close our eyes to segregation, although the federal government combats it. Nor can we accept material success as a way of life." So here he's critiquing the United States. Senghor pronounces, "We stand for a middle course, for a democratic socialism," in quotes, which goes so far as to integrate spiritual values, a socialism which ties in with the old ethical current of the French socialists. It is one of the clearest definitions about what it is that they are about. Having provided brief synopsis of what lay at the core of African socialist tenets of the four leaders, and I use all their works to talk about what they meant. Let us now turn to how their economies fared under African socialism. All four leaders developed control regimes in terms of economics, where the state and not the market determined economic conditions. And the economies of all four countries fared badly under African socialism. Nkrumah was the first of the four leaders to be pushed out through a coup d'etat in February 1966. But by 1961, the Ghanaian economy was already in trouble. The CIA kept a lot of records on Nkrumah. So let me quote you a CIA memorandum from 1961. And these have now been declassified. Nkrumah's troubles are compounded by economic difficulties. World cocoa prices are at the lowest level in years, and cocoa farmers are further irritated by the allocation of marketing boards of funds to general economic development funds, rather than the alleviation of their special difficulties. Moreover, even the broader economic programs have misfired to the point that in the 4 years since independence, the government has squandered a financial patrimony of £250 sterling through ill-advised development schemes and the construction of imposing government buildings and lavish living by officials. Current indications are that Ghana's reserves will have run out by 1962 and that the Nkrumah government will be in desperate need of budgetary support from abroad, as well as financial aid for existing development programs. So that is the CIA. Ghana's external position, reserve position, deteriorated sharply between independence in 1957 and in 1966 when Nkrumah was overthrown. And Ghana's external reserves would decline from $269 million in 1957 to negative $391 million. I mean, they've come down. In short, by the time of Nkrumah's overthrow, Ghana was bankrupt. Guinea, the country that had forged a union with Ghana in 1958, did not fare any better, though Sékou Touré did serve as head of state until his death in 1984. Guinea's economy on independence was based on banana plantations and mining in diamonds, gold, bauxite, and iron. In 1961, when Kennedy became president, he approved an aid program for Guinea despite the protestations of Charles de Gaulle. Touré gladly accepted the offer. And Touré did prove that he was not an ideologue. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the request of Kennedy, Toure would deny Russians the permission to refuel their planes in Guinea-Conakry on their way to Cuba. In this early period of independence through 1963, Guinea's economy was marked by soft control. It is striking and not coincidental that Sékou Touré moved towards a hard socialist regime in 1964 after the death of Kennedy. When he was informed that Kennedy had passed away, his response was, and I quote him, "I have lost my only true friend in the outside world." Quotation closed. Tanzania underwent one of the major economic transformations in the history of independent Africa. When under the force of the government, 9 million peasants were pushed to relocate to development villages within a period of 4 to 5 years. So this is massive transformation. The government resorted to compulsion when it became evident that peasants were not interested in communal production. About 70% of the Tanzanian population had moved their homes by 1975. Under the Arusha Declaration in 1967, the government had announced its intention to nationalize industries. When Nyerere took stock in 1977, he admitted honestly that the economy had done badly, both in agriculture and in industry. He conceded that, and I quote him, "The truth is that the agricultural results have been very disappointing." Quotation closed. In terms of industry, I quote him again, "Almost all our industrial plants are running well below capacity. Sometimes less than 50% of what could be produced with existing machinery is actually being manufactured and put on the market." Okay. By the late 1970s, Ujamaa had been abandoned. There was no incentive for peasants to exert themselves when they could not reap the rewards of their labor. Strikingly, unlike Ghana and Nkrumah, which was penalized by the Western donor community for Nkrumah's socialist policy, donor money flowed in throughout Nyerere's period in government. I argue that the international donor community could see that Tanzania was in search of an indigenous economic model. And though they may have disagreed with Nyerere's policies, they respected the sincerity of his endeavor and his integrity. And reflecting the man of integrity that he was, Nyerere decided to step down, admitting that his policies had failed and that it was time for other ideas to be explored. He remained respected to the end of his life, a moral force in Tanzania. So let me conclude. So this is where we're trying to keep the baby. By the late 1970s, the rise of Milton Friedman and monetarist economics, and the leadership of the United Kingdom under Thatcher and the United States under Reagan, signaled a major shift in Western economic policy. Clearly, all the African socialist policies of our four leaders had failed. So what is worth salvaging from this period of Africa's history? It is the vision of bold and broad transformative change that I find admirable and worthy of emulation. The desire to lift entire populations out of poverty and give them a decent life, as evidenced in Nyerere's efforts. Though of the four leaders, Nkrumah's regime was the most short-lived, it perhaps left the largest legacy. Many of Nkrumah's plans that he could not implement have been resuscitated under various subsequent governments in Ghana, and those that remain dormant excite the imagination. Nkrumah not only planned the Volta River project and the Akosombo Dam, he made plans for building 2 additional dams at Pong and Bui. The Pong Dam would be constructed under the Akyeampong regime in the 1970s. The Chinese will come and build the Bui Dam, exactly where Nkrumah wanted it, under Kufuor in the early 2000s. Nkrumah began to drill for oil in Hafasini, in the western part of the country, in the 1950s. Half a century later, Ghana has become an oil-producing region, exporting oil from this very western part of the coastal seaboard. In 1962, Nkrumah got the Russians to commit to building a railway from Kumasi to Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. It is still dormant. To add value, he established the cocoa processing factory in Tema in 1963, saying that we cannot just export cocoa beans, we have to add something to it. Many new highways have been built in Ghana and have deteriorated. The motorway Nkrumah built to link Accra and Tema remains the best highway in Ghana today. Africa's population is set to double in 2050. Much of the minerals being exploited now are expected to have been exhausted by then. Even now, Africa cannot feed itself, though it possesses the most unfarmed arable land in the world. We need the bold and transformative vision of the likes of Nyerere and Nkrumah to ensure that come 2050, we don't find ourselves in the same predicament as on the eve of independence, when our new leaders were faced with what appeared like insurmountable challenges. Thank you.